My name is Nim Gorokot Palomraksa. I will take care of the session today. We are delighted to welcome Christopher G. Moore and John Burdett, two best-selling authors, with moderator Jim Algie, author of Bizarre Thailand, Tales of Crime, Sex, and Black Magic. Please welcome Christopher G. Moore, John Burdett, and Jim Algie.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming. We've got a lot of fascinating ground to cover this afternoon in 1 hour, so we're just going to launch into it very quickly with discussing some of the latest books by his authors. Bangkok Asset by John Burdett, and a more recent one by Christopher Moore called The Marriage Tree. How would you guys describe the general story arc of these books, but also how they differ from the other entries in the series? Chris?
First of all, thanks very much for coming today. It's a real pleasure to be here. Before I talk about the books, I just want to say that the organizers have done a wonderful job of putting this together, and they briefed their staff very well. And I know that usually these briefings, they ask the author a question, is there anything that you need? And I said, yes, I need a deck of playing cards. And so she came back and reconfirmed that 3 or 4 times to make certain that that's what I wanted. And she said, are you sure? Do they have to be plastic? Any playing cards will do. So I was given playing cards here, and I want everyone to notice that there's an excise tax seal on these cards if there happen to be any bridge players in the room. And what I would like to do is to make a wager, a bet, that you will enjoy this presentation this afternoon. Thank you for being here, and I'll let John start with his books first.
Okay, well, the last book called Bangkok Asset is, it differs considerably from the earlier ones. What happened was I'd sort of set a trap for myself. Anyone who knows the series, the John Somchai series, knows that he's a Luk Kran, his father was a Vietnam vet, and ever since the first book people have been asking, so when is he going to meet his father? And I sort of, my mind, obviously in reaction to that, is working on that because I didn't really think about him meeting his father at the beginning. So, his father was a Vietnam vet. I thought, well, I really have to roll up my sleeves and look into the Vietnam War a little more closely. I was a teenager at the time. Huge demonstrations in London and, of course, all over the United States. They were kind of a dim memory, you know, like when you see a newsreel from long ago, maybe in black and white, and it's not too clear. But after I did the whole of my research, I visited Vietnam quite a few times. I did a lot of research on the net. I did an awful lot of research into vets in America, the different kinds of vets, the different sort of predicaments they get into. Some of them have done very well, others much less well, as everybody knows. And so that's really where the book's coming from. I made the discovery, actually I was discussing it with an eminent American writer. I was asking him about the plot. He said, well, what you really need to do if you're going to go into the Vietnam issue like that, you need MK Ultra. So I looked up MK Ultra. MK Ultra was the name of the most extraordinary experiments on human mind control conducted by the CIA, also by the Canadian government. And it was the origin of the LSD experiments which precipitated the swinging 60s, as everybody knows. So it's a very different book. It's got all that in it. It's longer than my other books. Also, in my opinion, it goes deeper. I mean, you're talking about a man who meets an eccentric Thai policeman who meets an equally eccentric father figure. I won't take up any more time.
Yeah, John, is that why you missed your deadline by 4 years on that book? I think this
Well-
might help to explain the long lapse between books, right?
It was, yeah, it wasn't the writing that took so long, it was the huge headache the plot gave me, because like I said, it's not like anything I did before. And having cross-references to Vietnam, the Indochina War, was not anything I'd done before, so yeah, it did take a lot of arranging.
Chris, The Marriage Tree, part of a trilogy within the Calvino series, which is interesting.
Right, and The Marriage Tree is part of a trilogy inside of a larger series that has 15 novels in it now. The trilogy started with Missing in Rangoon, which is set in Burma at the time of the opening of the lifting of the embargo. And The Marriage Tree is really a follow-on book from that, where Calvino is seeking to recover from post-traumatic stress, having witnessed and been involved in some fairly significant acts of violence while in Burma working on a case. And something about The Marriage Tree reminds me a little bit about something I read in Gabriel Garcia Marquez some time ago, where he said, "What matters in life is not what happens to you, but what you remember and how you remember it." So basically what Calvino is doing is coming to terms with the memories of what happened in that dangerous, violent time in Rangoon. And at the same time, he's out jogging one day around Lake Rashida, near the Queen's Heritage Center, and comes across the body of a young woman. Reports this to the police. The woman has no identification on her. And Calvino, being at the scene, the police do what the police usually do. They assume the person who found the body must be the killer. So he undergoes a little bit of first-hand interrogation that no one, including his best friend, Colonel Pratt, can save him from undergoing. Ultimately, the police decide Calvino isn't the murderer, but an illegal immigrant who's selling peanuts along Sukhumvit Road seems to fit the bill much better than the Falong. So the Falong is taken out of the jail and the illegal is put into the jail. And meanwhile, Calvino knows that this is a setup and is looking to find out the identity of the girl, which leads him into refugee camps in the north of Thailand, one of which was burnt down. And this leads as well to the Rohingya and the illegal sale of those people to the fishing industry. So the book covers a contemporary aspect of Southeast Asian life, which is modern day slavery, illegal immigrants, policing techniques. As a result, I use crime fiction in this series, and particularly in The Marriage Tree, to try to illustrate what seems to me are pressing contemporary issues that all of us who live in Thailand are aware of, and like to see how those are dramatized. So The Marriage Tree brings in a whole set of new characters into the series, and there's a bit of an underground railway which is financed by NGOs to allow the rescue of the Rohingya and to allow those people to resettle in other countries. The book that comes after that's called Crackdown, which is set after the coup. So those three books are really part of what I call the Great Unraveling, a look at contemporary Southeast Asia, Thailand in particular, as well as Burma, and asking some of the hard questions about some of the very pressing issues that are social, economic, and political. And the fact that I'm still able to sit here and talk about this is a testament.
There's no more cliched question, I think, to ask an author of fiction or a novelist, and what parts of their books or characters are autobiographical? I mean, it's almost a Larry King kind of question, so I'm going to ask it anyway, John. But you and Chris, with your detective heroes, what parts of them specifically have you drawn on aspects of yourself or your own experiences, and what other parts are just complete inventions?
I don't know that it's possible to answer that question, because what comes out on the page or on the computer screen is a synthesis of just so many things. But what I can say is when I invented the character Sonchai Jipki, what I saw, and making him half Farang helped in this way, what I saw was an opportunity to show someone based firmly in Southeast Asia, who nevertheless, thanks to the internet and all the other recent inventions, social media and so on, has something of a universal mind. So what's going through his head as he proceeds through the city, following his cases, usually at breakneck speed on the back of a motorbike taxi, is the whole of Western consciousness, which he has kind of absorbed, sometimes in a half-baked way, sometimes in a very perceptive way, which he sees also through Buddhist eyes. So, and it's what I think is wonderful about Thailand, is that it's a place that exists in a number of different fields of time. You've got Buddhism. Buddhism is more than 2,400 years old. You've got the high-tech, most recent high-tech stuff. You've got Sukhumvit and everything that's happened and is happening on Sukhumvit at the moment. So you have the whole range of recorded history in here in Thailand, in Bangkok. And it's sort of that little snippets, juicy little snippets of information, a lot of it completely useless, and a lot of it is his opinions, and he changes his opinions all the time as they hit him as he passes through the city. So it's really the vast amount of information that's available and is kind of living and comes out of the stones really here in Southeast Asia, which obviously it affects me that way, and I'm able to challenge that into my central character and some of the other characters as well.
Chris, now that John has artfully dodged the question, what ways are you like Vincent Calvino, or have you just invented the character that way?
I'm part of the Flaubert school, Madame Bovary c'est moi. So I think that there is an aspect of an author in every single book that they write. You can't help but write out of your own experience, out of your own personality, your attitudes, your set of values, the social constructs that you managed to grow up with, some of which you've destroyed. And again, quoting Marquez, says that, really we have three lives. We have our public life, we have our private life, and we have our secret life. And when you're doing a character, in a sense, what you're doing is recreating that tripartite division. Calvino will have a public life when he's out and about. He will have a very private life when he is in his office or with Colonel Pratt or with MacPhail, another one of the leading characters in the series. And of course he has a secret life. And the secrets are coming out, certainly in the marriage tree, through the analysis that he's having with the psychiatrist over the post-traumatic stress and the kind of demons that are inhabiting his world, his cognitive mind. And I think that's an interesting aspect of the series, is when you start to look at the secret life of a character. Because in some ways we're all seduced by those silences, by those gaps, by those secrets. We all have them, and occasionally we might share them with a friend, but when we can read about that in fiction, we have a sense of empathy, because we know we have those aspects of our life as well, and we're curious about how others deal with them and how they share them.
Thank you for a little more honesty there, Chris. But still, no autobiographical professional revelations, but never mind. Okay, moving right along, here's something about John a lot of people don't know. I was quite surprised to find this out, and I've never heard you mention it in any interviews before, but being a part of kind of counterculture radical in the 60s, even traveling around on the hippie trail and living in a cave in Greece for a while. And I was wondering about all those kind of experiences. How have they informed or impacted on your novels?
This guy never gives up, does he? Well, I wanted to be a writer, I suppose a poet, from the moment that I discovered Rambo. Not that I could understand his poetry, I just loved his lifestyle. It was bohemian and compulsive traveling all over the world, sort of a low-life existence that was part of the French literary establishment at the time. And I guess that, I mean, it's hard for people to imagine when we're living in what someone said is a post-literate society. It's perhaps hard to imagine just how powerful the thoughts and lives of writers were when I was growing up. Not that long, well, yeah, quite long ago, but the influence of people like Sartre, like Graham Greene, like Camus, and so on was so powerful. And so what a lot of us were doing, I was one of them, you go off with not much money and a backpack and a few paperbacks in your pockets. And I used to do that with some chums, and we used to hitchhike across Europe. And then we finished with school, and I had a gap year. They were very new at that time, not many people took them, but I took a gap year and travelled. And because I had no money, I wound up living in a cave in Crete. And caves were called the Matala caves. They're actually artificial caves. They were dug by lepers about 200 years ago. It sounds as if I'm going off the point, but I'm not, because those caves in Matala were actually a colony of people who were sort of, you might say, refugees from the Western establishment. A lot of vets, a lot of Americans who'd been drafted into the war, done their year or 2 years, I can't remember, I think it was 2 years, and just did not want to do anything at all, came and just hung out in the caves in Matala. And it was that kind of literary background. I then went and studied literature, English and American literature at university, which really formed what you might call my literary persona. But then I did a very non-literary thing. I decided I needed money, and I qualified as a lawyer, and I wasted the next 14 years of my life practicing law. Not actually wasting, because I made enough money in Hong Kong, where law is very well paid, to retire at a ridiculously early age, so I could write my books. And that's all the autobiographical input I'm prepared to make at this stage.
Okay, thank you. That's an interesting parallel, though, between yourself and Chris, who also comes from a legal background, and you taught law and also practiced it yourself, and occasionally you were telling me you still get involved in a murder case. Or...
Yes, I was a law professor in Canada and in a law lecturer in England, and I practiced law for about 15 years as well as a consultant. So I come from a very similar background from John, and I think it's been a very useful background, because when you train as a lawyer, you learn certain kinds of skills that are very useful in fiction writing. You learn things like to focus very carefully on the evidence you have. You learn to observe in a particular way. You understand the importance of investigation and the importance of allowing the evidence to emerge from the evidence what are the truth of the situation, as opposed to deciding what's happened and then finding the facts to support what you believe has happened. So it was a very good training for me, and it allowed me to meet the kind of people that were very useful for me as a fiction writer later on. Particularly in England and in New York City, where I was able to do ride-alongs with the police. So I was in New York in 1984 to 1988, and in squad cars out in the parts of Brooklyn which were no man land in those days. So I was able to see an aspect of urban violence and the kind of vulnerability that people have that live in that environment. And that marked me forever as someone who understood what it's like to feel fear. True, genuine fear, and other emotions that go with it. Hatred, revenge, hopelessness, and despair. It was there in that period of time in New York in the 80s, and it was there in spades. And so when I had that background, I was able to come out to Southeast Asia at a time when this was still a place cut off from the rest of the world. It was a faraway place in 1988 when I came here. There was no internet. It was very hard to get a fax machine. You needed a special license for a fax machine in those days. There was no SkyTrain. It was really the world of Somerset Maugham and Graham Greene. And so it was interesting to take those legal skills from those days to the current time when we now live in cyberspace, most of us. I'm glad to see no one has their iPad or their cell phone on at the moment. But that is the world that we live in. And so the legal background, essential for me as a writer, and I think it's certainly informed John's fiction as well.
Yeah, what specifically, John, piqued your interest in writing about crime, though? Did that come out of your legal studies and some of the cases you worked on or research you did at the time?
I think it was two things. Yeah, that was very important, not just because of the cases in themselves, but because you then, I then had a great deal of confidence that what I was writing was not just fantasy, it wasn't made up. I mean, police procedure is very, very similar all over the world. The kind of procedure that the Thai police take people through is almost identical to Hong Kong or the UK. And so it enabled me to be authentic in that way. Also some spectacular crimes, not just violent crimes, but massive frauds of an extraordinary extent, really make you understand that criminals do not look at the world in the same way as the rest of us at all. And in some ways it's extraordinarily liberated because they don't care about anybody else and they don't care about breaking the law. So you get some amazing numbers when it comes to money and drug smuggling. There was one island just off Hong Kong Island which was nicknamed Treasure Island. But it was nicknamed Treasure Island by the police because they were making so much money out of it at the time. So stuff like that, and also what they often say about lawyers is that because lawyers have studied the law, we're all too aware of how defective it is and how unfair it is and how easily bent it is. So the law then becomes a flexible thing, something that can be manipulated. And being aware of that also, I think, is useful for anyone who's writing crime fiction.
Yeah, the police in London or New York would probably not arrest a group of elderly bridge players. There are certain eccentricities in the Thai police, which I think you focus on in some of the books.
I don't know what turned them against bridge players, I really don't.
Another thing we wanted to talk today, just books in general and crime fiction about bridging different cultural divides and gaps, because Thailand is unusual in having a real cottage industry of homegrown publishers and just tons of books out about the expat experience, memoirs, crime, Thai culture, temples, fruit carving, the supernatural, whatever sort of subject you want is out there, and that seems to be very peculiar to Thailand itself. I haven't seen that in any other countries, but I'm assuming a lot of the Farangs are reading about Thailand to learn things about Thai culture, history, Buddhism, and that. I mean, how do you think, John, that your books, I mean, you address, or just address some of the reader concerns and the feedback you get from readers and things like that?
Well, I described my first visit to Thailand, Bangkok. It was kind of love at first sight, but the fact of the matter is I knew very little about the country. And when I came to live here 12, 13 years ago, and when I started researching the book, I really had to go into it in a much greater depth. I also realized, because as everybody I suppose knows, my main sort of area of study is the red light districts. So hanging around the red light districts, I finally realized that almost everybody, put it the other way, almost nobody was from Bangkok. Almost everybody was from Chiang Mai provinces, and almost everybody was from Isan. And Isan, they speak a different dialect. They think of themselves as Lao as much as they think of themselves as Thai. completely different attitude, a completely different culture. Fantastically interesting in and of itself, and I suppose you could say, as far as the Thai official Thai establishment's concerned, it looks to them like a subculture. And from that, frankly, you can understand an awful lot of the politics that have been going on over the past 12 years. So all of these things really amount to building a much more sophisticated and a much deeper picture of the country that I sort of landed in 12 years ago. And one of the most important things of all, I suppose, is the religion. I had no idea how deeply and genuinely religious so many Thai people are. Buddhists, of course. And this fascinated me. I never really thought of Buddhism as something that would grip me. But when I started studying it in order to get into the character of Sonchai, it began to fascinate me, and it still does.
Yeah, there's a great anecdote early on in Bangkok 8, I think, after Sonchai's partner is killed, and he goes back to the police station, and I'm really curious to see how you would play that scene and was going to dissolve into kind of sentimentality or a bit of a tearjerker scene. Instead, the other cops, they don't even really commiserate that much or anything, because it's just seen as part of a natural, the Buddhism, the process of life, death, rebirth, and everything. And I thought that was really insightful, and just looking at the way Thais react to these kind of situations, you know?
I believe so. I want to be careful because there are probably some long-term Buddhists in the audience, but my understanding of Theravada Buddhism, is the more austere form of Buddhism, is that it's the outer world is not that important. It's what you've got inside yourself. And if someone is very, very unhappy, you feel sorry for them, but you don't kid yourself that you can get some sort of elastoplast and fix the problem, which I'm afraid in the Western attitude is a bit like that. You tell someone a problem, immediately they think, well, we've got to solve this problem for you. And usually it just it becomes another problem that someone's trying to solve your problem for you. Whereas the Buddhist attitude is very much that your problems are internal and you have to work them out through your own karma, through your own faith.
Yeah, I think that, again, it goes a little bit to our legal training, is that we're trained as problem solvers. And crime fiction usually sets up a problem, and the problem is if someone has committed an act of violence or some other kind of crime, and it's trying to figure out how you deal with that kind of breach in the social fabric. And how you deal with the breach in the social fabric takes you into the culture. There are many differences that you experience in Thai culture. It reflects in a lot of different ways. We're all familiar with the skin whitener commercials in Thailand as an example of what is beautiful is a very light colored skin. And removing your shoes before you go into someone's house, again, is a very important part of Thai culture, as is loss of face, getting lotto numbers from dreams or from fortune tellers, auspicious days to open parliament, or for a wedding, or for an engagement. All of these are small things individually, but collectively they form a very unique identity, a way of being in the world. And a novel that can reflect that way of being in the world really helps others who don't live in Thailand understand very basic ways that Thai people react to things emotionally because of these cultural aspects in their life. Certainly religion is part of it, but it's much more than just religion. It's the relationship that Thais have with their parents, with their neighbors, with their school friends, the way they keep in contact with school friends over the years, the kind of networks that Thai people have amongst themselves. All of these create a kind of society that's important to understand if you're going to write a novel and ask people to have empathy with characters. They want to have empathy with characters that are believable and plausible. And the plausibility has to draw from the cultural content of which these people live.
John, what sort of feedback do you get from readers? Do you hear a lot back? I mean,
I was
criticisms, fanatical hate mail, how does that work?
I was just going to say that I should have mentioned in my last answer that a lot of the feedback I get from people all over the world, especially the US actually, is great. Now I understand the city that I've just visited. You know, it's like just simple things like getting on the back of a motorbike taxi. I guess if you're a tourist, you just arrive from New York, the last thing you think of, oh yeah, I'll get a motorbike to take me over there. And stuff like that. And so a tourist who doesn't know anything about the place just lands here, sees people moving around on the back of motorbikes and wondering, you know, what's going on, what's the deal here? I think the motorbike taxis are terrific, by the way. They're the only way of beating the traffic jams. I do get some feedback from feminists who don't like the way I describe prostitution. My answer to that is you haven't studied this particular market. I don't know anything about other markets, but the red light districts here in Bangkok that cater to Westerners are very, very special kinds of places. It's an extraordinary business because usually the girls come from the Isan normally. They come from small rice farming families, subsistence farmers, and I'm afraid in their mind, coming to work in a Farang bar in the red district in Bangkok is the best option they've got, because the other two options are work in a clothing factory 12 hours a day for pittance slave wages, or work on the farm, and very often there's no money there at all, you're simply subsisting. So that's the way they look at it. So I'm often criticized for telling what I think is the truth. I have no particular bias either way. I'm just telling what I believe I've seen after talking to an awful lot of people in the business.
And yeah, you were telling me though that you have got some negative feedback about the Vietnam parts of the new book, just from vets who've taken exception to your portrayal of events, or the vet experience, would it be?
Yeah, that goes back to what I believe was my first answer. The research I did in Vietnam led me to certain conclusions. And I had no idea that there was still a whole sort of standing down army of vets who think that they fought a heroic war. I don't see it like that, and the coverage of vets, their lives after they returned to the US, indicates something quite different than the heroic images. And some of the really tragic and really bone-shaking coverage of those vets who were involved in special forces, and the things they did, and the shame and the horror that they look back on those days. These, I didn't shrink from putting that into the book in one way or another. And I've got quite a few vets who have written to me and expressed their disapproval in certain terms. Sure.
And moving along, Chris, I just wanted to talk briefly about movie deals, because I know you guys have both signed a few, and you even had one producer send a Hollywood screenwriter over here to meet you, do some research, and then gave you input into the first draft of the script, which is very, very rare in Hollywood. Is there any hope, Chris, of bringing that movie to the big screen?
You know what? There's always hope. Whether that hope will be realized is always another issue. Getting a film made, it's a little bit like shooting 9 basketballs at the same time, and they all have to go through the hoop. If one bounces out, you have to start over again. So getting a film made is a very complicated enterprise. I've been fortunate to have the Calvino series of 15 books under option for the last 7 years, and so they have been renewing the option every 18 months, so they're about ready to have the 5th renewal. The latest has been to look at Netflix as a possible TV series. But they have sent not just one, but 2 separate screenwriters to Thailand for me to basically take around to introduce them to Thailand. So you can imagine what you can learn in 1 week. But remember, this is Hollywood. A week is a long time for them to finance someone. They put them up in an expensive hotel. You know, they're eating the buffet lunches and so forth. While I'm outside eating in the street, and then we meet afterwards. And I take them out to see Father Joe Meyer at Klong Toi and to various other places. They're kind of the secret back roads. But what's interesting is to kind of see the eyes opening, because these young Americans that they send over, it's often their first time abroad, and what they know about Thailand is probably what we sitting in this room would know about Sierra Leone, which is very little. And after they go back for having spent a week, then they are set loose to write the script. And as I said, so far there have been 2 full-fledged scripts written for the Calvino project. And between now and April will be a big decision time as to whether they will go ahead and continue with the option. I hope that they do, and I'll keep you posted on my website, so you'll know in April whether the option is going forward.
And John, all the books in the Sunshine series have also been optioned to different movie producers, haven't they?
All my books have been optioned. The second one was not about Thailand, it's about Hong Kong, but the Fox, the film company, actually bought it outright. So I mean that was really quite pleasantly surprising. But they still didn't make the movie. It's just that they paid me a lot more for not making it. And the other books, they've all been optioned. The Hong Kong book also, there was a script. Nothing came of that. The other books, yeah, there was a script. They sent over a team. There was the director and his scriptwriter came, and we had great fun. And the screenwriter became fascinated by the red light districts and has been back many times since. And has decided that whether he makes my movie or not, he's going to make a movie based in Bangkok for sure, sooner or later. But it's just exactly as Chris says, unless all the ducks are in a row, completely and perfectly aligned at exactly the right moment in time, you don't get the movie. They just don't make it. You can understand that a huge amount of money goes into movie making. And you can also not understand, because it's a complete waste of so much money when you can't help thinking that they could organize themselves a little bit better than that. I've had since the Sunshine series, the first book was published 12 or 13 years ago, and all the series has been optioned without break ever since, and still no movie.
Okay, I think we'll move along to the Q&A segment now, Nim. If anybody's got some questions to ask John or Chris about any things we've been talking about or other subjects perhaps. And we've also got Nim on hand if any Thai people here would like to ask a question in Thai, and she can translate for us.
You can raise your hand and we can walk to you with the microphone so everybody can hear the questions. You can ask a question to Jim directly too. You're also the author of the book Bizarre Thailand.
No, they can't. I'm going to be a prima donna about that, but anything for John and Chris, yeah.
Okay, hi. I was interested, Chris started off mentioning the bridge episode, and I just wondered something for both of you, and Jim too, since you wrote Bizarre Thailand. Do you ever come across anything that is so bizarre, you just can't put it in the book because nobody will believe it, and you can't be convinced about it? I think before the bridge episode, well, even after, could you put that in a book and make it get away with it? So maybe you've got some secret stories to tell there.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. Chris and I were just talking about that last night, that truth really is stranger than fiction in Thailand. It's really hard to outdo those kind of stories because they're so outlandish. The bridge story, for example, And yeah, a lot of time it's not such a problem here when you're pitching them to local readers and friends. But for example, a couple of years ago, I sent a story off to Australia, a newspaper there, a woman I knew, and it was about the Phuket Vegetarian Festival. People are skewering their cheeks, and she writes back to me, Jim, it's a family newspaper, for heaven's sake, man. I know you've lived in Thailand a long time, but this stuff is really shocking and gory. So that's just an example of, you do kind of forget that when you live here for a while, how weird that is. Like, even when I'm going back home and telling friends about certain anecdotes, I go, shut up. And I think, well, is that a new colloquialism? No, just be quiet, man. No, I don't want to hear anything more about it. And their eyes glaze over and they're just not interested, But do you guys have that problem?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, basically, fiction has to be plausible. Reality doesn't. And that's why you have things like the Bridge Club. So many things that happen that you read about in the newspaper, if they were in a novel, you would throw it against the wall. The guy's crazy. I don't want to read this kind of thing.
It's a very good question in the sense that how much of reality can you put into a book and without losing the audience? My second book, I tried it. What happened was I worked in the Attorney General's chambers in Hong Kong, and I had to deal with people who were appealing clemency from the death sentence. And so one case I had to look at was a case where a drug deal went badly wrong. So they shoved the unfortunate victim into a meat mincer, a large meat mincer. And I put that in the book. And ever since then, people have been saying, "You sadistic sod, how could you do something like that?" Well, it's the one thing that's actually true,
Okay, anybody else?
In front,ค่ะ. So we have about 15 minutes on this thing, so.
During the Vietnam War, I was a student at Berkeley, California. So I have a question about the relationship, the possible relationship between, excuse me, Eastham, the Vietnam, and the NGOs. Sometimes I have the impression that during the Vietnam War, the Eastham region was struck by a lot of things happening, like the building of Air Force bases, the destructuring of the sociological structure, the family structure of the region, the creation of R&R activities, and then now the Vietnam War is long gone, but I have the impression sometimes that the NGOs kind of rebuilt what was destroyed. So I just wanted to have your opinion on the possible relationship between NGOs, Eastham, and Vietnam.
The only thing I know about that directly, I knew an American pilot who was the commander of the Air Force that was flying out of Isan, out of northern Thailand, to bomb northern Laos. They were defending, or they claimed to be defending, the Hmong people who were under attack from the Vietnamese. And the effect that it had was absolutely disastrous, not only on the, as you say, on the population around the base, the R&R and all that, but on the men themselves, because all of a sudden the American government stopped the project, and the Hmong people, I don't know if people follow this, it's still in the news today, were left almost without a country, without support, without anything at all. It was just one of those decisions that a big country makes. We're going to do this, we're going to save these people. Oh, no, we're not, we've got something else on our hands now. And it's all forgotten about. And that sort of destroyed some of the pilots who really, perhaps unlike Vietnam, the pilots really believed that they were on the side of the angels up there, because mostly it was action against northern Laos.
I think one of the things about the NGOs, I think is a very good point, is that I think the NGOs during that period of time, particularly along the Cambodian border, Burmese border, there was Laos, the war went on for quite a long time, particularly in Cambodia. I know my wife, when she was in university, worked at a refugee camp there, and a number of other Thais learned, I think, a lot about humanitarian and human rights issues by working in these camps and working in other NGOs that are related to the kind of refugee problem and other kinds of problems that arose not just from Vietnam, but from Cambodia and from Laos, and as well as the fighting in Burma.
That corner, thank you.
There's so much fiction, poetry, music, and art being done by people who live in Southeast Asia now, which kind of focuses on and uses the noir themes. I wondered if both of you, who are kind of leading members of the Bangkok Noir movement, could reflect on what you think of as the noir themes that have impacted your fiction.
It's a good question, Chris. And just to give a little bit of background, the notion of Bangkok Noir started maybe 6-7 years ago. I edited an anthology which John Burdett and others are in, called Bangkok Noir. Chris Coles, who just asked the question, is one of the leading painters who paints in that tradition. Chrome out of Cambodia has music in that tradition. John Gartland is a poet. There are a number of fiction, non-fiction writers who contribute to this as well. Noir is kind of a flexible term, but if you think about the possibility of a drama from which there's no real possibility of escape, there's a sense of almost despair or doom that the system is collapsing, it doesn't work or function the way that it should be working. There's no sense of fairness or justice. That ultimately, this person, no matter which way they turn, there's not going to be a good outcome for them. So it is a kind of a time in Southeast Asia, a time in the world where a lot of people are having these kinds of pessimistic thoughts. It's not that it's totally pessimistic, but it's towards the line that we have far less control over our lives than we think we have. Things are far less predictable than they wish they would be. And when we read crime fiction, we find within that world of crime, as John Burdett had talked about earlier, a whole different set of values. And those values threaten us as a society. And in some ways, the crime fiction has become almost a metaphor for the larger world that we live in. We no longer kind of see that as separate from us, but that we're living in that, and we have to deal with these kinds of dangers, these kinds of risks, these kinds of outcomes. And that's part of the reason that crime fiction has been very popular right around the world. It has tapped into some very basic emotional fears that people have of what it is to work, play, to be educated in modern 2016. It's, William Gibson, who is a science fiction writer in Vancouver, said, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed.
Thank you. So the next question, Jennifer.
Chris, that kind of segues into what my question was. You talked earlier about how in your latest novel that it's much longer because you're talking about so many changes and different levels in Bangkok, things that are happening. And you obviously are still here, so you haven't been attitudinally adjusted or anything. And I'm wondering how you do deal with some of this reality, which is exactly the definition of noir you just gave, without like stepping into the doo-doo and getting in trouble.
Well, I probably do the worst thing that a lawyer can do is to follow his own advice. I try to understand the realities of where I live, and part of what I've done is, as you know, I write nonfiction as well. I have 4 books of essays out: The Cultural Detective, Faking It in Bangkok, Fear and Loathing in Bangkok, and The Age of Disconsent. So I deal with a lot of these issues in an essay form, which are, if you look at an essay is a world of ideas. Novels like what John and I are writing are, yes, there'll be ideas there, but ultimately it's creating or recreating an emotional terrain. I mean, if you think of a book, and the reason you read a book is it's a little bit like going into a simulation. It is your virtual reality. You inhabit those characters. You become part of that setting. It becomes, during the process of the reading, your life. And if it doesn't, you put the book aside and find one that meets that kind of condition. So what you're looking for in the best fiction is to validate the truth. Because basically, we assume that there are always a lot of lies and propaganda and prejudice and bias out there. And we turn to fiction for truth. That's the ultimate contradiction about life. The one place where the truth is, we call it fiction. Think about that for a moment and think that's the place where we feel the most comfortable, the most validated, the most alive, because we can travel through the lives and the minds and the emotions of others. And by doing so, we finish that journey knowing ourselves much better.
Okay, on the left hand, James.
This is a question for both authors. Given that you are both, I'm guessing, born in the West, do you think that it is important to get feedback from your Thai peers in regards to the authenticity of the Thai characters that you incorporate into your novels, even though you're writing for a Western audience? Is that a part of your research process, like seeking validation, as far as whether or not your depictions are culturally accurate?
It is in my case. I think that's what I was talking about earlier, being out in Isan or the Vars and doing the research and actually talking to people. Country folk in Thailand tend to be very open in what they will tell you about their lives. So you do end up with a factually rather accurate picture of what's happening and what the prevailing value structure is. And that's what I've always striven to do. And I think it's what is interesting anyway in any novel, if you're getting in not the unnecessary detail, but those details which illustrate every level of consciousness of your main characters, because we're all changing our minds all the time about everything. And if you get the dynamic of the thing as opposed to simply bland facts, then you're actually reproducing the city itself in the book. That's at least what I'm trying for.
Absolutely excellent question. One of the things I learned when I lived in England is that if you're born in England, your ability to go across class lines, demographic lines, is limited by where you were born, your accent, your education, all these kinds of things. The English would pick up in just a few moments, and immediately you're pigeonholed. And by being pigeonholed, that's the worst thing that can happen to you, because you're then dealing with stereotypes. So as a Canadian, I was able to go across class lines in England, and I found that experience very useful. I did the same thing when I lived in New York, and I've done the same thing in Bangkok. The important thing is to make certain that you're not just validating one point of view. Everyone in their society, Thailand is not monolithic. There are many diverse communities inside Bangkok, inside of Thailand. So anyone who talks about the Thai as one thing is asking you to buy into an identity that simply I have not found. There are many different Thai points of view, as you would expect. And one needs to be respectful to that diversity, because it's in that diversity that you learn the deep things about the culture.
Wow, reading the books is not enough, but listening to the books just like this. It's very grateful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Christopher, Jim, everybody, John. Thank you. So, if you are interested in getting to know their books more, there are books, there are books, many books outside. Please visit and welcome to have more chit chat.